Good afternoon and welcome to the book launch of our new Armed Conflict Survey 2020-2024. We're delighted you're joining us in person as well, and also our participant online. My name is Irene Mia. I'm the editor of the report, and I'm also senior fellow for conflict security and development in Latin America. And it'll be my pleasure to chair the event today. I'm joined here by some dear colleagues, friends of the report, and regional experts to discuss the state of the current global conflict landscape and its outlook as well, for what it matters, as well as some notable global and regional trends our research has highlighted. I will introduce them very, very briefly now in order of introductory remarks. To my left, John Rain, who is Senior Advisor for Political Due Diligence at the IISS. To my right, Dr. Benjamin Petrini, who is a Research Fellow for Conflict Security and Development and is also my consulting editor for the ACS. To my right as well, Raul Roy Chanduri, who is a Senior Fellow for South and Central Asian Defense Strategy and Diplomacy. And finally, Dr. Nigel Gould-Davis, to my left, who is Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the IISS. So I will take my prerogative as the chair of the event to start off by introducing briefly the report series and also make a couple of comments on general trends we have observed in our work this year. And also I will say a couple of words on Latin America, which is my region of expertise. And then I will pass the floor to my colleagues. Each one will have around 6-7 minutes, a bit more even, for introductory remarks. And then we'll open the floor for conversation, which we hope is going to be as interactive and as interesting for you as possible. Of course, we have 1 hour and a half, so we don't have much time. We have quite a lot of people online, but I'll try to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to ask questions. And also, we're trying to, the aim is really to cover all the regions, so every question is admitted. Just a couple of words at the series. The report, what we try to do with the series is really try to provide a strategic understanding of armed conflict across the world. We try to identify domestic and geopolitical drivers, conflict parties, and regional global linkages and outlook. The series has been going on since 2015, so next year is going to be our 10th anniversary. We'll have a party. Unfortunately, there is no lack of conflicts. What we see is actually our outlook is actually quite dire, as I will mention in a minute. But just for the people who are not familiar with the series, so as I said, the coverage is global. We cover all active conflict across the world, which comply to our criteria, very broad criteria to consider an instance of armed violence as armed conflict, which is the duration, intensity of the armed confrontation, and also the organization of the parties. So that allow us actually to consider conflict which are not necessarily classic conflict, but they are driven more by by economic dynamics, like, for instance, organized crime in the Americas. The report is structured around conflict profiles for each conflict, but also we have a big focus on the regional dimension, because as we know, more and more conflicts are becoming increasingly regionalized and transnational. So you'll find this kind of regional focus throughout the book. We also include for each region what we call a regional spotlight, which is a trend, a short essay on a specific trend which is relevant and is key for the region and also globally. So this year we have something on the expansion and diversification of Mexican cartels for the Latin American section. We have instability trends in the Western Balkans for the Eurasia section. Iran and its network of non-state armed groups for the Middle East section. The impact of the Ethiopia-Somaliland Memorandum of Understanding on regional stability for the sub-Saharan Africa section, and also paths toward the integration of Afghanistan into the international community. Some of the speakers sitting here are actually the authors of those very, very interesting essays. So we will be discussing more in depth on those different issues. The other thing the report is very good at doing is really trying to provide standardized, unique data and information on conflict parties, with a particular focus on non-state groups, for which there is actually very little information which is standardized across the world. And also, you'll see in the report is very rich in data, in infographics, and also visuals, because what we try is also to bring the conflict trends to life to a certain extent. We also try to be quite forward-looking, so we try to really look at what are the regional outlooks for peace, but also for war, and especially also try to identify what are the future hotspots for conflict or the area of fragility we should be mindful. Just a couple of general points of some of the trends we have spotted across the conflict landscape, and especially looking at it globally. So the first thing, as I said, we have unfortunately highlighted for the last 10 years is that the global outlook for peace is rather bleak. There is what we have been kind of recording over time, over the last 10 years at the very least, is an accelerating number of conflicts. At the moment, there are over 130 conflicts active across the world, which is one of the highest number in decades. Also, we see conflict being increasingly intractable and protracted, and this is because what we see is an increasing, a proliferating number of conflict parties, domestic and external. We see proliferation of drivers as well, overlapping drivers, geopolitical and domestic drivers, but also escalating geopolitical tension and fragmentation, which actually complicates further any type of resolution or pacification in most of the area in conflict. The other thing we have highlighted, especially in the reporting period of this year, which is end of June 2023 to beginning of July 2024, it's really the rising intensity and human cost of conflict. The deterioration of global security, notably after 2022 with the war in Ukraine, has brought with it remarkable destruction, human suffering across the globe, increasing deteriorating crisis in Gaza, in Yemen, but also Sudan, the Sahel, Myanmar, and Haiti in Latin America. You'll have there in that graphic actually the changes in fatalities across time. And in general, what we see is that fatalities from violent events have rose by almost 40% year on year globally, with peak as in the Middle East of something like 315%, as you see in the graphic. Also, what is quite concerning is the fact that what we call the intensity of conflict, which is the ratio between fatalities and violent event, is actually increasing. So it means that there is an increase of approximately 20% in this overall ratio of fatalities per event, which shows that actually the confrontation are becoming more lethal, or have become more lethal, more actually deadly in the last year or so. The other thing I wanted to highlight and also to show you, this is actually very small, but you have it in a very big version in the book. And you can put it on your wall if you wish so. We know that Benjamin's dad notably had all the last 4 years in the wall, but you know it's. What I just wanted to highlight that there is also this other kind of sister product to the report. What we try to do every year is highlight a trend in the conflict landscape. This year, what we try to do is trying to highlight a little bit the economics of conflict, and that's because we do actually pay quite a lot of attention at the economics behind conflict. Just because not just economic competition over resources is a major driver of conflict, interstate and internal conflict, but also because given I would say, growing importance of the criminal economies as exacerbator and driver of conflict. So that's you'll find in the map. The last point I wanted to highlight, just in general, about our report, it's something that we have been, paying a close look in the past 10 years, and it's really the importance, the increasing significance of non-state group in conflict dynamics. What we see really as one of the most defining trend of the global conflict outlook across the world in different ways, it's really the rising importance and influence of non-state armed group in driving conflict dynamics and global instability. The universe of non-state armed groups is very diverse. The taxonomy is very diverse. It goes from more classic kind of insurgent with a political agenda to organized criminal groups whose drivers are simply economic. But I think what we have seen over time is that what those groups are have in common is really their increasing power at a time when the state reach and power is decreases, and legitimacy of the state as well is decreasing. What we are showing on the map there, and it's data from our friends at the ICRC, it's really the reach of non-state armed groups in terms of provider and kind of alternative to state, their kind of quasi-state role. So those really important and really unique data from the ICRC show that there are over 140 armed groups of humanitarian concern across the world, and about 210 million people living under their either fluid or total control. Of this group, 80% provide services to the population under their control. Services that goes from basic services like infrastructure, utilities, to education, health, security, and justice in many ways, in many cases. They also, those groups extract taxes from the population under their control. So really, state within the state, increasingly in many countries. In Latin America, it's quite striking because we think about those groups as criminal groups, but actually, it's the percentage of groups in Latin America providing governance is something around 96% of the total groups, which are 84 in the region. So actually much higher than the global average. So I guess the question, this situation actually raised the question of how do you deal with those actors, right? Which is something that the IISS have long actually paid attention and kind of did research around, because in a way it's really as these actors become more political and geopolitical, of course they're part of the dynamics of conflict. And the question is, what are the parameters? Is there any parameters within which state actors need to engage or interact with those groups to achieve their kind of pacification and peace goal? So that's a big question. I think we'll leave it open. We'll see in some cases, in the case of Afghanistan, or even Syria, I guess, how this play out. But it is a very important topic that we at the IISS feel very strongly we should be doing more research, as well as really trying to provide more information on the dynamics of those actors, the business model behind these actors, and also the taxonomy of those actors, which is really all important element to understand this universe, increasingly important. I would just say a couple of words on Latin America because we have quite a lot of Latin American online. And maybe I will just expand with those points on the non-state armed group with respect to Latin America, which I say it's an interesting case studies, because obviously those groups, with the exception of the partial exception of some non-state armed groups in Colombia, have traditionally been criminal groups, right, with exclusively criminal motivation. But what we have seen is that those groups actually have developed an incredible geoeconomic or economic power, and that geoeconomic power has actually, in a way, fueled them to, or driven them to become increasingly political, both in terms of, how they function within the state, as I mentioned, as state, but also in terms of trying to influence political decision and political decision at home and abroad as well, which is the concerning element. So I'm just going to show. I mean, I'm showing a couple of graphs from the report, and the thing I would say is really what is particularly noticeable of those groups is that, particularly after the pandemic, those drug trafficking organizations have really morphed into multi-million-dollar business with a worldwide presence. They operate in global supply chain and also have a network of international associates. While cocaine trafficking remain a very important business line for this organization, they are currently present in myriad of other sectors: agriculture, counterfeit pharmaceutical, environmental crimes, money laundering, and especially human trafficking and human smuggling. Of course, driven by restrictive migration policy and humanitarian crisis. This is a case for Latin America, but in general, it is a business line which unfortunately is becoming more important for criminal economies. And it's also unfortunately bound to become even more important given the way in which the world is going. Interpol actually estimates that the size of the illicit economy around human smuggling, human trafficking, is now more or less the same size of the cocaine, the illicit drugs market, which is incredible if you think about it. It's really huge. So these slides refers to the most established, I would say, Mexican cartel, the Sinaloa cartel, and the Jalisco New Generation cartels. And you see that how they are actually connected across the region in terms of, and across the world in terms of partner, business line, supply chain. What is actually also quite interesting, which is maybe less known, is basically the Brazilian drug trafficking organization. This just one word on that. We have been focusing particularly on the First Capital Command, the PCC, which is another interesting group, because in a way those groups in Brazil were, I mean, they basically originated in the 90s as prison-based gangs, mostly to protect, the prisoners and mostly to control the cocaine trafficking in Brazil, which, as you know, is the second cocaine market in the world. But actually, over time, they have developed into a very sophisticated multinational criminal enterprise with global reach. They have also expanded their activity from the domestic market to really become a central player in the expanding cocaine markets in South America, in Europe, and in Asia. Capitalizing on Brazil's geostrategic position and also control of ports and transport link, as well as cultivating important alliances with overseas criminal groups, including the Italian and Balkan mafias or mafia-like organization. And also what the PCC has done is really developing very advanced money laundering capabilities. And this is important because also the money laundering is really if you think about it, it's really what drives those kind of dynamics. In general, just in terms of the growing, last point on the growing economic power and political power of those groups, I think Latin America, but is a general manifestation we see across the world. There is this idea that the geoeconomic power is in a way driving an interest and a willingness to become more political, right? In order to be able to influence political decision and foreign policy decision because they do have a strategic interest. So what we have seen is that those groups have in many ways tried to either challenge or infiltrate the states, sometimes with violence, sometimes trying to sway the electoral outcomes of election using intimidation, political violence, but also just the votes they controlled as a bargaining tool with different candidates. Political violence has been escalating in Latin America, which is a growing threat, I think. We all remember the assassination of a presidential candidate in Ecuador last year at the end of supposedly one of the criminal gang there, Los Lobos. but also electoral violence. We have seen, notably in Mexico, where we had an electoral season last year, has been escalating with a lot of violence and attack against candidates. Mexico Evalúa and Animal Político have actually calculated the number of attack in the last for 2018-2023, and they are counting about 1,600 victims across the electoral cycles. Groups like the PCC, for instance, are interesting because they're less violent. They don't really they try to use more their kind of financial muscle to corrupt, so using more corruption really rather than direct violence. But I think in general, what I would like to highlight for the future, for our outlook for Latin America, but also in general, is that on one side, this is not going to change, it's just going to become worse. There are endless opportunities for diversification for those groups in Latin America, but across the world, in terms of drug trade, environmental crimes, human trafficking, mining, especially if you think about critical minerals, that's one area where there could be more of that. And also, obviously, the geopolitical, the more complicated and increasingly complicated geopolitical landscape is going also to create more opportunity, notably the rivalry between the US and China. But also, obviously, you know, if you look at the Trump administration, clearly trade and migration policies are going to exacerbate, again, all those kind of driver for migration and for more opportunity for organized groups across the world. I think in general, what we have seen is that normally, in the case of Latin America specifically, governments have oscillating between trying to, you know, negotiate with those groups on specific issues, notably the reduction of violence, or they have implemented iron fist policies. But the reality is that addressing the transnational character of those groups requires transnational policies. So I think that's the challenge going forward. We really need more kind of transnational approaches to those challenges. We need better international cooperation and coordination, especially to tackle illicit financial flows. At the moment, Interpol estimates again that only 1% of those illicit financial flows are actually intercepted, frozen, or recovered successfully, which is 1% is nothing. And also, of course, I think it's important, and I will conclude my very long introductory remarks with the fact that we need to put the nexus between governance standards and security at the center of the security conversation as well, right? So it's really if we manage to address the nexus between lax government standards, both at the state and corporate level, and security, this is a solution really to weaken the grip and the power of these criminal groups. So really, corruption and fragile institutions are I would say the main weakness that create an environment which is conducive for criminal organization and organized violence. And with that, I'm sorry, I was a bit long, but I felt that I had to cover Latin America as well because of the audience today. I will pass the floor to John.
Thank you, Rainey. Could we have the graphic for the Middle East, which is now of historic interest? So I'll just try in 5 minutes to say what's changed and what might happen next, with particular reference to non-state armed groups. So first thing is that the non-state groups were driving the conflict in the Middle East. Behind them sat Iran, but the regime in Tehran was careful to stay behind them. On 2 occasions it was not behind them, and it didn't like it. That was when Israel attacked it directly. So the dynamic for conflict in the Middle East was Israel versus non-state armed groups. Israel is still there, and the non-state armed groups are still there. But what has changed profoundly is 2 things, which we have tried to reflect, I think, Rainey, there in the updated graphic.
Yes.
One is that the keystone in the arc of resistance, Hezbollah, has almost collapsed. as a result of two things. One, IDF kinetic activity, which has been at an unprecedented level of intensity and accuracy. And secondly, is the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria. Syria was geographically essential in order to resupply Hezbollah, and it was ideologically essential to the Iranians because it was, for the best part of 40 years, their only serious Arab state-level ally. That was until Iraq became an ally. So that's gone. So two key things have happened to affect the fate of Iran's network of influence. Now, how serious is this for Iran? Well, the Iranians are putting a brave face on it and maintaining defiant rhetoric. And guess what? They're blaming it on a US-Israeli conspiracy. Well, that makes them feel better, but it doesn't cast much light on what has really happened. And they know that it's a nonsense. So the question is, first of all, are any of these non-state armed groups resilient and autonomous? Will they continue despite the collapse in Iranian support? And the second is, will the Iranians try to rebuild their network? In 2019, we published a strategic dossier on Iran's network of influence, and one of the judgments on that, I was rereading it earlier to see if anything has survived from that, was that for Iran, the use of its influence through partners and proxies is a defense priority and a foreign policy objective, and I still think that's the case. So this is a regime whose internal architecture and whose foreign power projection has pivoted around the ability to exploit communities overseas in their immediate environment, which is largely the Middle East, although it does extend in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and to turn them into non-state armed actors. So it's been a bad year for Iran, and next year may be bad too. But until the regime itself changes, they won't abandon this strategy. Statements from senior figures, including the Speaker of the Majlis and the head of the IRGC, Hossein Salami, have included statements such as, the resistance is resilient, and these groups will now look after themselves and they will rise up. So Iran has played a long game in the region, played a long game with non-state armed groups, and it will continue to do so. My prediction, won't abandon this policy. There is a rider to that, which is that the regime is keen at the moment not to get itself further exposed with the arrival of Donald Trump, sworn enemy of the regime, and with its air defences crippled by the Israelis. It does not want to give an opportunity to Israel and the US to take further action against it. But it's not going to abandon that policy of supporting non-state armed groups. So, second point on non-state armed groups is, for those of you who read our 2019 survey, you'll realise that the range of non-state armed groups in the Middle East is very, very wide. And it includes many which were essentially community defence organisations. In Syria, there are a large number of community-based organisations. I think it will be very difficult for them to lay down their weapons. The levels of trust with central government, like everything else, we don't really know at the moment. But historically, they have been low, and there's no particular trust in Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So I think it will be a long time before those organisations are all of them dissolved. There's also a second category of organisations which had some sort of strategic alignment to Iran. There were Shiite groups, there were Alawite groups. Many of these are in areas which Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has not yet pacified. It will consider them hostile, and it may be that they put up some resistance. The big policy objective for the new government in Syria is the same as it was in Iraq, which is at some point you've got to disarm all these groups. But we should not underestimate How many of these groups there are, I haven't even touched on the Kurdish-aligned groups, of which there are subgroups and misaligned agendas and Turkish-backed groups. At some point, all of those have to be either absorbed into government or defeated in the field. It was something of an illusion that the civil war was over. It was also something of an illusion, as it still is now, that the map of Syria divides conveniently into big blocks. It's a lot more complicated than that, and many communities will seek to retain some sort of defense capacity. Elsewhere in the region, the other third big question is what happens now to Hezbollah. So Hezbollah were often regarded as the archetype of both Iran's proxies, but also of a non-state armed group. They were a state within a state. It's too early to tell, but they've got a number of serious challenges. One is that Hassan Nasrallah, who held the organization together, has gone. And he, over the years, managed very cleverly to reconcile groups within Hezbollah into certainly a unified front. Secondly, they are now isolated physically, and their ability to resupply and to receive the physical oversight of members of the IRGC has disappeared. They're on their own. To an extent, they were not. So IRGC personnel have pulled out of the region very largely. This is particularly difficult for Hezbollah. And the third problem they have is that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham hate Hezbollah, and that rivalry could be very damaging for them. What we may see more generally in the non-state armed arena is a resurgence of Sunni assertiveness in a number of ways. HTS itself will provide some leadership in that. There is a deep resentment in both Iraq and in Syria towards the dominance of Iran-backed groups and particularly the IRGC in internal politics. I will be surprised if there isn't some form of reaction, certainly in Iraq, which taps into this. So the great irony of Syria was that it was a country in which a minority of a roughly 1% of the population, 1%, the Alawites, was ruling with an iron fist over a country of Kurds, Sunni, and other minorities, all of whom now feel as though that rather ironic situation now needs to be reversed. The great difficulty is, and relevance for today's discussion, is that they are all organized into very capable, battle-hardened, non-state armed groups. It's praying for a miracle that we get through the next stage of Syrian history without those groups at some point coming into conflict.
Thanks, John. That was fascinating, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. By the way, for people online, if you want already to write your question in the Q&A, because then we'll be actually looking at them at the end of the session. Benjamin, for Africa.
Thank you very much, Irene. Very, very happy to be here. Very excited to launch our new report this year. I will focus mostly on sub-Saharan Africa, and I have three points or three areas that I want to cover. One is the trends and a bit the landscape of armed conflict in sub-Saharan Africa. Second, a decline of the Western influence and multilateralism on the continent. And third, I want to touch upon the humanitarian situation and humanitarian trends. So first of all, in terms of landscape of conflict, you can see from the map the hotspots of conflict going from west to east are the usual as the ones that have been for at least the last decade. And we can pinpoint the macro region of the Sahel, the Central Africa region, including Central African Republic and the Great Lakes region of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the whole Horn of Africa, where we can also list Sudan and the civil war that has been ongoing for over a year and a half there. Now, it's very hard always to make typologies on these conflicts, but I think it's important to sort of point some commonalities. So I would identify 5 diverse types of conflict situations among all this constellation of conflicts. The first one is sort of the domestic insurgencies and rebel groups that seek to seize power at the central level. So these are mostly, one could refer to sort of more Cold War style wars. And here, these types of conflicts have been declining, but Somalia would be an example of that. Second type would be the non-state armed groups that were previously part of the state and now are fighting a civil war, and Sudan is the primary example of that, but also the Ethiopia civil war between 2020 and 2022, with the Tigray region fighting a civil war to regain power. The third one is the third category is the one that shows more variation, and are those sort of highly localized and fragmented non-state armed groups that have diverse features and characteristics, and something that this has in common with other regions like Latin America and also the Middle East. And here we have many different examples, local self-defense militias that act as state proxies like in Burkina Faso. We have fragmented groups that are not necessarily pursuing power or intercommunal type of conflicts. We have increasingly criminal outfits engaging in banditry, kidnappings, illicit activities, and we see that in the DRC, northern Nigeria, but in the Sahel as well. The fourth type is secessionist groups of de facto authorities, and so those subnational conflicts. And we see those as in the Tuareg rebellion in Mali, the Anglophone separatists in Cameroon, as well as different situations in Somalia, like the region of Somaliland or Puntland. And the fifth type is those regional conflicts that are fueled by transnational Islamist and non-state armed groups. And this has a very clear international component, and we see those in the Lake Chad Basin, in the Sahel, and these are where the transnational and the international dimensions comes forward, where non-state armed groups exploit porous borders and share a radical jihadist agenda. But this is not the only international dimension, and I want to mention also that there are interstate tensions that are currently being managed between DRC and Rwanda, as well as between Ethiopia and Somalia. And then the most visible that then is about the geopolitical competition and the increased presence of different actors. So if we go to the next slide, the internationalization of armed conflict is the most visible trend of the last decade. You see the color, the purple colors, those are the civil wars that have external military intervention by a third party. And so you can see clearly that in the last decade, those have skyrocketed and now are even a larger number of these conflicts versus the normal civil wars. And so this is the most consequential trend of our time, which is not new this year, but it is persisting. And the other trend that I want to mention here is obviously the rise in non-state armed groups, in the proliferation of non-state armed groups and the proliferation of non-state conflicts, which have decreased in the last 3 years, but are still at a very, very high level compared to the 90s and the 2000s. So who are these external powers intervening more and more in conflicts? We have, the Western countries, but as well as Russia, Gulf states, Turkey, China, and Japan. And so if we go to the next slide, I will jump into my second point, my second sort of set of remarks about the decline of Western influence, which is pronounced in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in fragile and conflict-affected countries, but not only in them. So what is driving this decline? Well, first of all, from a domestic point of view, there has been a call for renewed sovereignty by African countries, which is eroding the web of Western alliances in several of these countries. Increasingly, African countries have found themselves frustrated with the West, which is perceived paternalistic and neocolonial. But especially in fragile countries, the West has not delivered on addressing conflicts, and this is the most important driver of this decline of influence in the Sahel. Now, this has led to a reassessment and in certain cases to a rejection of the partnerships with the West, both diplomatic and security, in both diplomatic and security terms, but also in economic terms, but also a rejection of democratic practices. Now, if you look at the map, here we have showed the countries that have suffered from a coup since 2020, and this is several countries, all the Sahel, but also non-conflict countries like Guinea and Gabon. And something else that the map looks at, that the map highlights, is how these coups in the last few years have gone in parallel with executive branches evading the constitutionally set two-term limits. And so out of 49 countries in the overall continent, 26 of them either do not have term limits or have not respected them. So this is usually these two-term limits for executive branches, for presidents, is usually like a measure of the state of democracy in these countries. And additionally, another important point is concern restraints restraints of conflict parties. So the capacity of the West and of multilateral actors to impose restraint on conflict parties has eroded, has waned. And this is clear when we look at Sudan, when we look at other conflicts, and this is beyond sub-Saharan Africa. When we look at conflicts that probably a decade ago or in the 2000s, the multilateral system would have been able to impose ceasefires. Now, this restraint is mostly gone. A second driver of this decline in influence is the geopolitical competition. Sub-Saharan Africa increasingly is approached as a key theater of this confetition. There is a diversification of the partnerships. So many countries, both conflict affected and non-conflict affected, the latest example is Senegal, are seeking economic partnerships, diplomatic and also security ones, with non-Western countries. And this is something that is new, and the West is not prepared to, has not been prepared to respond or to accept that there are other partners, especially in the security realm. So who are some of these countries, especially on the security file? Russia, the Gulf, and Turkey are those that have brought forward the partnerships given the security deterioration in these regions, in the Sahel, but also in the Horn of Africa, in Sudan. Many of these state actors have impeded or have complicated efforts to secure some pacification and some ceasefire. The Sahel is a primary example of the decline in Western influence, with the failure of the French operations to address, security operations to address the conflicts there, has led to a dramatic shift in the balance of power. In the space of 3 years, France has been ousted in security from the security partnerships in Mali, then Burkina Faso, Niger last April, and now Chad just last month. So this country, there's been this domino effect, and Chad, for example, is now exploring strengthening ties with Hungary and with Turkey and with the Emirates. So now Chad is a very important country because it's really at the center where it has influence both on the Central Africa region, on Sudan, as well as on the Sahel. And it is a gateway for many of the trafficking of smuggling going into Libya and then to Europe. So I would really point to Chad as a hotspot. Now, the other aspect about the decline of the West is in terms of the decline of the UN influence. And this is a decline in terms of operations, but also legitimacy. Now, this decline has gone obviously hand in hand with geopolitical competition. And it is something that as well goes beyond the sub-Saharan Africa, but involves as well, yes, South Asia and the Middle East and other regions. Now, the primary sort of point about the decline in this in multilateralism concerns the divisions in the UN Security Council and the increasing use of veto power. In the last 3 years, China, Russia, and the US have used the veto power 16 times. In the previous 3 years, they've used it 7 times. Now, this is global. It's not just for Africa. So this is a clear example. It's a clear point about how this has impeded multilateralism in advancing ceasefires or for collective or resolutions for collective goods. As well as there has been a decline in operations by the UN. And the most visible is in peacekeeping, as you can see from this slide, which is from a piece that I wrote at the beginning of the year. In sub-Saharan Africa, there are today only 4 peacekeeping operations, which is half the number that there were a decade ago. But even more striking, in the last 10 years, there has been no new UN peacekeeping operation on the continent. So all these, the measures that you can see in the graph, there has been a shrinking number of operations, shrinking budget, and decreasing, obviously, number of blue helmets. In this last year, and something that we report on the book, both in Mali and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, have asked the UN to pull out the peacekeeping mission. Peacekeeping missions that were ongoing for 1 and 2 decades, respectively. So these are like dramatic events there. But also the UN political missions are in decline and increasingly contested. Sudan and Somalia have asked quietly the UN to terminate their missions there. And in parallel, there has been a rise in regional organizations, the so-called regional economic communities like ECOWAS, IGAD, and others in their mandates and in their peacekeeping operations. And it is something I will not address here, but you can read in something on this in the book and on our website. My last point, which I think is critical to mention in the context of today's armed conflict, is about humanitarian trends. And this will go, I'll talk about beyond just sub-Saharan Africa. Globally, the civilian casualties have increased by 72% in 2023 compared to 2022. And we obviously do not have certain numbers for 2024 yet. And as conflicts have become more violent and more protracted, more and more civilians obviously are in need of humanitarian aid. The most critical crises in Africa are in Sudan, Burkina Faso, Somalia, DRC, and Ethiopia. And globally, we can add, obviously, Gaza, Haiti, Yemen, Myanmar, Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan. The list is very, very long. According to the UN, in the last 5 years, the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance has doubled. There are, as this month, as December 2024, over 300 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, up from 168 million in 2020. The number of forcibly displaced people, combined refugees and internally displaced people, stands today at 122 million, which is a number that tripled in the last 15 years. Now, the consideration of these humanitarian catastrophe in terms of armed conflicts is that this rise of humanitarian needs is an evident sign that wars have become more protracted and that combat zones have widened to civilian areas. Protection mechanisms are ineffective or have eroded. And so there is no surprise then that these trends go in parallel with more and more violation of international humanitarian law. So I'll conclude with just one point, that at a time when we insistently talk about the increase in defense budget, in defense capabilities in the West, we think it is a moral obligation to also increase aid budget. And this is compared to defense budget, this is like a minimal. But if we need to address in the West wars and prepare for wars in the future, we also need to address the impact of those wars.
Thanks, Benjamin.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for for this very comprehensive analysis of Africa, and also on touching on some of the other trends that we have highlighted in the report, which are valid for all the region, notably what you were mentioning about humanitarian cost and resources needed to address those crises across the world. We're moving now to Asia, to the Taliban, which is unique, I would say, an important case of how non-state armed groups become state, and how do we deal with them? Raul.
Thank you, Irina. But first, really, many congratulations on the book. I mean, it's what I've often described as protein-rich in terms of what is inside the book, to you and to Benjamin. So, in your opening remarks, Irina, you highlighted the rise of non-state armed groups as influential domestic political actors. And as Irina has mentioned, I will, in my introductory remarks, be specifically looking at one such group that now runs the country, the Afghan Taliban in Afghanistan. In August 2021, the Afghan Taliban forcibly returned to power, making headline news the world over. Today, nearly 3.5 years later, the Taliban regime is in full control of the country with repressive and rigid policies regarding inclusive representative governance and certain rights of women and girls. This has taken place in the absence so far of any formal diplomatic recognition of the Taliban regime as the legitimate government of the country. Although the West seeks regime transformation in Afghanistan with no intent or appetite for regime change, in return for formal diplomatic recognition of the Taliban regime has refused to make compromises on its rigid policies. This is testing the patience of the West amidst the attention of the international community and global media in the past 3 years, shifting to wars, conflicts, and confrontations in Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia, alongside the uncertainty of the incoming US Trump 2.0 administration's policy towards Afghanistan. Yet the Taliban regime's policies towards girls and women has become even more rigid. Restrictions on girls' and women's education continue. Recent Taliban vice and virtue laws prohibit women from speaking or showing their faces outside their homes. And last week alone, the Taliban suspended medical education for women and girls. Other significant challenges also remain within Afghanistan. A recent World Bank report highlighted weak human capital, high unemployment, widespread poverty, and food insecurity, with the country remaining dependent on external financial assistance. Although the Taliban maintains that it has curtailed the operations of terrorists acting against the US and its allies on Afghan soil, terrorist groups remain active, notably the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, and Al-Qaeda. Yesterday's suicide bombing that killed Afghan's acting Minister for Refugees, Khalil-ul-Rahman Haqqani, the most senior Taliban leader to be killed in the past 3 years, was blamed by the Taliban on the so-called Islamic State terror group. Although the Taliban has launched effective counter-narcotic operations since it assumed power, how long it will be able to sustain this is unclear, as it has no credible alternative plans for farmers who are reliant on income from poppy cultivation. There has simultaneously been a major and rapid expansion in the production of methamphetamine. Nonetheless, we believe in the book, a new normal has emerged, as we highlighted in the book's chapter, in relation primarily, though not exclusively, to Afghanistan's regional engagement. This is marked by a rise in diplomatic presence in Kabul and the appointment of Taliban officials to key diplomatic missions abroad, all short of formal diplomatic recognition of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. To date, the Taliban regime has official diplomatic representation in 15 countries. They include the first of 2 ambassadors that it has, the first ambassador in China since December 2023, and most recently in the United Arab Emirates since August 2024. Russia's decision yesterday to remove the Taliban as a proscribed terror organization paves the way for the 3rd Taliban ambassador in Russia, which also Russia has hosted the Taliban's first military attaché since March this year. The Taliban regime's the chief of missions, short of ambassadors, are also present in, among other countries, Pakistan, Iran, Oman, Malaysia, Qatar, and Turkey. All 5 Central Asian states have Taliban diplomatic representation, and recently, an acting consul was appointed in the Afghan consulate in Mumbai, in India, to handle consular matters. At the same time, 11 countries currently have ambassadors heading diplomatic missions in Kabul, including China, Russia, Japan, Iran, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Uzbekistan. Several regional countries have chargé d'affaires, including India, Iran, and Pakistan. 3 Gulf states, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and all 5 Central Asian states have ambassadors in Kabul. Only 2 countries, Iran and Pakistan, also have consular presence in Kandahar. And the importance of that we all know in terms of where the actual power flows from within Afghanistan. In effect, the current new normal of expanded diplomatic engagement, primarily by regional countries, has had, we argue, the cumulative effect of eroding the non-recognition approach of the international community, with creeping normalization taking place. To conclude, we therefore argue in the book that in view of the new normal of diplomatic engagement with the Taliban, amidst the Taliban's refusal to make compromises on its rigid policies, a new focus on quiet diplomacy is also required. This could take place through the convening of small, private, and strictly confidential series of Track 1.5 dialogues. These would require informal outreach to the Taliban leaders based in both Kandahar and Kabul to ensure the participation of Taliban officials and influential representatives, along with the right mix of non-Taliban Afghans from various ethnic backgrounds, including Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras, and Uzbeks, and women participants. The objective of such forums would be to move from confidence and trust building to dialogue and discussion on a roadmap for the reintegration of Afghanistan into the international community, which is the title of the chapter in this year's Armed Conflict Survey. Thank you.
Thanks, Owen. Thanks again for the essay, which was really interesting. And I think it becomes even more relevant because of the many people kind of looking at similarity between Syria and Afghanistan in many ways. But we go now to the other big theater, in conflict theater in the world, and so we move to the interstate war, where probably the role of non-state armed groups is not as big, but nevertheless, I think to remind us also that there are still interstate war going on in the world. And Nigel, your assessment, and also I suppose there'll be a lot of question also in terms of the role of Russia after also.
Yeah, thank you, Irena. So let me just offer a few remarks about the past year and looking forward some of the key themes to think about in respect of what we still sometimes unhappily call the post-Soviet space. So this year's Armed Conflict Survey does make reference to concerns about some resurgence of Islamist attacks in some parts of the region, notably 2 significant attacks in Russia, one in Moscow itself. In addition to that, there are unresolved issues about the future of the regional security order in the South Caucasus, especially the prospects for a full and final peace settlement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. In addition to that, Georgia is once again in the spotlight following the most recent election victory of Georgia Dream, and then the subsequent suspension of its EU accession process, which has provoked very large and ongoing demonstrations in and around Tbilisi. We'll see how that works out. But of course, the conflict that continues to dominate the geopolitics of this region and beyond is the Russia-Ukraine war. Let me touch briefly upon 2 themes, which I think a lot of people are thinking about now. The first is the interconnections between this war and some other regional conflicts, and the interconnections across the world of conflicts is an important theme of this year's Armed Conflict Survey. And the second theme I'd just like to address, because it really is an uppermost in everyone's minds now, in particular as we await the return of President Trump to the White House, is the prospects for some kind of peace settlement, or at least cessation of the fighting in Ukraine. So let me take those 2 issues in turn. Firstly, the question of the interconnections between what has been happening in Ukraine and other parts of the world, and capacities and interests in other parts of the world. Now, if you look at what's happened on the battlefield in Ukraine over the past year, there's been limited, relatively little change. We have seen some advance by Russian forces in Ukraine, troublingly for Ukraine and those who support it, at a faster rate now than at any time since March 2022. The other significant development was, of course, the incursion by Ukrainian forces into Kursk region, which is to say Russia proper. The first time foreign troops have occupied part of Russia since 1944. And although Ukraine has lost around 40% of the territory it held soon after that incursion, it remains, in most assessments, quite well dug in and will be hard to dislodge. But with those exceptions, and also I have to say, as my colleague, my naval colleague Nick Childs in the room, with some, I think, underappreciated, though not by Nick, successes that Ukraine has enjoyed in the naval aspects of this war. With those exceptions, there's been little significant change on the ground. The really significant changes, as I see them, have been in the extent to which Russia has deepened and thickened its relations, its economic, diplomatic, and relations of technology transfer as well, with other important states in other theaters, notably Iran, North Korea, and above all, China. Now, these trends did not begin in the past year, but they have significantly evolved and developed. They are driven by Russia's needs and weakness, by the fact that in order to pursue this war to the extent that it wishes, Russia needs ammunition, drone technology, various forms of sanctions evasion, and most recently and remarkably, troops, forces, which North Korea, of course, has been supplying since the summer. This is really an astonishing development. And I think if anyone had said even 2 years ago that over 10,000 North Korean troops would be sent to Russia to support Russia's invasion and themselves to fight in Ukraine, we would have been astonished. So this is also a reminder of how significantly and unpredictably wars can evolve and escalate. So the question always in these cases is, what is the quid pro quo? What is Russia supplying to these partners in return for the support that it's getting? And I don't have time now to go into detail, but happy in Q&A, and colleagues here will also have their views. But very, very briefly, I think really the trend and theme to watch and worry about here is the extent to which the help and support that Russia is providing to Iran, to China, to North Korea, in return for their military help to Russia, risks strengthening the capacities of these other countries around the world, and therefore destabilizing regional balances. So that's something to watch. Those interconnections across three unstable theaters now: Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. In addition to that, too new, too fresh to offer any confident assessment of, but something that we must all focus on in regard to the theme of interconnections. What are the implications of recent events in Syria, the fall of the Assad regime, for Russia, and including and in particular Russia's capacity to sustain its disruptive presence in Africa, given the importance of those Syrian bases for supplying the Africa Corps, as it's now called, under the post-Wagner military forces under, for the most part, Russian Ministry of Defense control. What will we see there? Will that damage Russia's capacity to project its power onto that continent? I'll leave that as a question without an answer for now, because we just don't know how that will develop. Now, on the war itself, very briefly, and the prospects for an end, because everyone is talking about this now, and of course Trump has made his promises about ending it on day one, which I don't think we can all believe will really happen, but he has talked, and his incoming Vice President, J.D. Vance, has spoken in more detail about the possible shape of a settlement. I think the first thing to say is that there's an important, indeed fundamental distinction to make between, on the one hand, a ceasefire, the guns falling silent, and on the other hand, an end to the war properly so called, which would mean a settlement of all of the larger issues that must be resolved in order for a genuine sense of stability and security to return to the region. That, I believe, is a very remote possibility. There are a number of fundamental issues which have to be solved. They include, for example, the question, most important of all to Ukraine, of future Western security guarantees for Ukraine. It involves the question of the war crimes that President Putin and others have been indicted for. What will become of those? The question of the future of the sanctions regime on Russia. And if there's any doubt, I'm happy to go into this in more detail, the Kremlin hates these sanctions. Don't believe anyone who says that sanctions don't work or don't matter. And indeed, the proof of that, if you needed it, is the fact that repeatedly Putin has set as a condition, even for starting peace talks, the lifting of sanctions on Russia. There are other questions, too, that have to be resolved, including the question of Russian reparations for Ukraine for the damage that is caused and which it is obliged to pay under international law, and so on. So the question of some kind of settlement is a remote one. So let's focus on the prospects, at least the more modest aspiration, for a ceasefire, for the guns falling silent. Now, I believe that a large number of people, frankly, in and around Washington, and I don't only or even primarily mean people around President Trump, but others as well, other commentators, and many of their counterparts in Europe, are making a great analytical error in assuming that this is more feasible than in fact it is. And the reason for that is that, at least implicitly, the assumption seems to be that reaching a ceasefire mainly means persuading Ukraine to make compromises and to accept some kind of painful trade of land for peace. Now, that's a necessary condition for the war to end, but it's not a sufficient one. The other thing that needs to happen, the much more difficult condition to fulfill, is that Putin must accept that peace better serves his interests and objectives than continuing the war. And frankly, I see no evidence whatsoever for that proposition, and indeed a great deal of evidence to the contrary. I think there is every sign that Putin's intention to achieve the initial primary objectives of his invasion, which is to say the political and military subordination of all, or virtually all, of Ukraine, and certainly Kiev, and in addition to that, the secondary objective of using that to bring about some far-reaching reordering of European security systems. Those objectives remain unchanged. It would require some very, very serious, not inducements and positive incentives, and the kind of language, sorry, we're getting out of Washington, but coercive threats on Russia to persuade him, to shift his calculus, to persuade him that it's more in his interests to accept an end to the fighting. And we're far from that. I can offer some speculation if you're interested in what that might look like, but it's very difficult to imagine that happening now. There are other difficulties and real, quite fundamental problems which people haven't thought through yet that would have to be solved even for a ceasefire, let it end into the war. I won't go into those now for reasons of time, but I just wanted to offer what I'm afraid is a sober assessment of the prospects for any early end to the fighting. Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel, and thanks also for reminding reminding us about the interconnectedness of the different theaters and the importance of this war also for geopolitical trends elsewhere in the world. We are a bit late. I think it was more the Italian component of the panel who didn't stick to the time. But let's take a bit of a number of questions in the room, and then we have a long list in the. Please, if you can just be really brief, please.
Thank you. There's an increasing tension between Egypt and Ethiopia over the dam, as you very well know. Is there a sort of an expectation of war between the two countries? And I was actually surprised that you mentioned Japan as a leading contender in Africa as well. Why? Also, you haven't actually mentioned Gaza at all. Do you think that the Israelis will be annexing Gaza in the future?
Yes. 3 questions.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Please.
With what you mentioned about Iran and its militias, I just wondered, would chaos in Syria kind of serve to keep open that gate that Iran has to the Mediterranean? And then my other question was, with maximum pressure, do you think that will be applied to Iraq, particularly where there is obviously the Shia militias, but also Yemen?
Johannes Leiters, I'm with the German newspaper. I would be interested in the consequences of the Russian withdrawal from Syria and whether you see this as a sign of weakening Russian influence in the Sahel region, and whether there are new prospects now for countries like Libya, maybe, and others in Africa.
Great question. And I'll take another one. This one. You have a question?
Yeah. I think for John again, you said praying for a miracle in Syria.
Yeah.
What's the best case scenario, and what are the best things that the West could do for that miracle to come about? And we've seen a conversation about delisting HTS, for example, or do you think HTS should dissolve themselves? Some of the options around that, please.
Very good question. Shall we go get those questions, which I guess are for you, John and Benjamin, and then we move to the maybe online.
Yes. Yes. Very quickly, the Ethiopia-Egypt prospects for war. Obviously, this because of the dam, there has been these tensions have been ongoing for like more than a decade. The real question is to the extent that the Ethiopia-Somalia tensions will be resolved. And precisely yesterday or today, allegedly both the two president and prime minister of Somalia and Ethiopia are meeting in Ankara. So I see many of these interstate tensions are very much intertwined, and so the Egypt-Ethiopia tensions will depend now from the outcome of the Ethiopia-Somalia one. I mentioned Japan as a security actor. Japan has a base in Djibouti, as a military base in Djibouti, as many other countries, has increasing interest, economic interest. So I listed it as one of the actors to be contended with. The question on weakening Russia in the Sahel in light of the Syria debacle. Well, there is like a logistical challenge that my colleague Nigel has referred to, and that will have to be seen. There is also, I mean, there is a political one, and I see very much the influence, the rising influence of Russia in the Sahel, independent from Syria. Obviously, the loss of Syria will very likely put more emphasis on Russia's interest in Libya. So I see that increasing. But I think that policy of rising influence, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad is ongoing, and it is there to stay.
Thanks, Benjamin. Nigel, did you want to add anything on the Sahel, on Russia and Sahel?
Only that, I mean, there are two elements to the problem. One is, as as Benjamin has pointed out, is even if Russia's capacity to supply its forces and activities in Africa is undermined, then to what extent is it, nonetheless, could they continue to operate despite that sort of logistical challenge? The second, sort of the underlying question, is whether Russia will in fact be forced out of Syria. And I suspect there is some very frantic diplomacy taking place right now, including and perhaps in particular between Russia and Turkey, with its influence in Syria, on how far Russia can retain its presence and its basing in Syria. John might possibly have a thought about that.
I'll pick that up, but I will definitely answer the other questions. The Russians are slightly fantasizing at the moment about retaining their bases, and Nigel's right, they're talking about it in diplomatic circles. The memory amongst Abu Muhammad Jawlani and members of Tahrir al-Sham is that Russians spent 5 years trying to kill them all. So I think their tolerances for a permanent Russian presence are going to be, let's put it diplomatically, very low. On Gaza, I didn't mention it only because I was trying to focus on Syria. To me, the connection between what is happening in Syria and Gaza now, it's not as great as people may seem. Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani himself has been quite careful about what he's said. Of course, he supports Hamas, but he's quite nationalist. And I say quite nationalist because we don't really know what he is. His focus is on the Golan. The kunya that he's adopted, Abu Muhammad al-Golani, indicates his agenda. Obviously, he's not happy with with Israeli incursions in Syria. But I think he's going to be very careful about how much he gets drawn into other conflicts. He's got so much to do at home. On the question of annexation, I answered with a yes, but there's annexation and there's annexation. What I see the Israelis doing is a combination of administrative control and permanent military oversight. And the administrative control will come through COGAT, which already has a kind of an assumed responsibility there. And the military control, we can see in alterations to the topography of Gaza, which give every indication of being done in order to allow IDF to enter and to leave. You know, technically, whether it's annexation, it probably won't be, but in practice, it might look a bit like that. And I would add the third is the enormous problem of the displaced people. So the commanders in the north have already said publicly they won't allow up to 250,000 people to return. I mean, if they don't allow people to return, it does look like a de facto annexation. That will be really hard for the international community, let alone the Arab and Palestinian community, to accept. That was on annexation. The other question, what's the best thing the West can do? First thing is wait. I mean, this is unbelievably fluid. We don't, I've said 3 times, we don't really know much about Jawlani, other than what's written in the prescriptions of him as a terrorist. But he's got a multiplicity of agendas playing out here. And I just think it's really important not to prejudice position by taking too early a position. There will inevitably be areas in which we can and should seek to cooperate. One will be on the humanitarian relief for the huge numbers of returning Syrians, displaced people, just standing up the state. And I think where there are, I'm not here to give policy prescriptions, but I think where the areas in which we can collaborate, we should, just on the humanitarian grounds. There are lessons to be learned from the Taliban, I think, Rahul, and how, what do we get right, what do we get wrong with the Taliban? But the big issue for me at the moment is going to be territorial integrity. And the difficult policy decision is, do we intervene in order to preserve territorial integrity one way or another? Not, I don't mean, sorry, by putting boots on the ground, that's the last thing you want to do. But in order to assist in, behind the scenes, diplomatically, whatever, in ensuring that we get a unified Syrian government, that to me would be a legitimate grounds on which to deal with them. And there's a question about Iran, sorry, Dominic, it was on...
So, if there is continuing chaos in Syria,
Yeah.
does that give them a lifeline to keep Hezbollah and other groups going? And then, if Trump is putting on maximum pressure, does he have to shift it all around the region to deal with the groups that still exist?
Yes. At the moment, I think if you stitch together the pro-Iranian to permanent strategically aligned groups, it's not enough to get you to the Mediterranean. I mean, that would be quite a lift. And the other thing is that, as you know, the IRGC just abandoned the Abu Qaim crossing point. So their lines of control, lines of communication are not under their control. So I think they like to think they can do this, but I think it's going to be quite hard. Too many people really don't want to see them back. It's been a central part of the HTS narrative. Trump and maximum pressure. I think he's interested in maximum pressure on Iran so that it forces the deal he wants. I just don't think he's that interested in Iraq. But the really interesting thing is what happens to those pro-Iranian groups now in Iraq. And for me, that's part of the bigger question is where does Iran's displaced capability go? Because, as you know, we've all discussed before, it has a huge machine to run this overseas network. So where does it get busy now? And the two main groups, Kataib, Hezbollah, and al-Haq, don't forget, they decided not to save al-Assad. Publicly said, we're not going to go in this time. So that would have created some, sets up a new dynamic. Either they got the green light to do that from the Iranians, or they went before the Iranians did. And, you know, they're under huge pressure inside Iraq to just be more Iraqi. So I'm not, you know, they too got a sort of slightly uncertain future.
So I'll take a couple of questions online. There is one, I mean, Raoul, I think for you, which is, what are the possible implications of regime change in Syria involving for another time non-state armed groups toppling an established regime for the security of South Asia, from Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Bangladesh? If there is any implication, you think, in the Syria?
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I think there obviously there are nationals of South Asia in Syria. They've in fact there are some religious groups also that are in Syria. In terms of India, I mean, the previous Syrian regime had a close relationship with India, and India saw that regime as a secular regime, which is important for India's foreign policy. So I think we'll have to sort of see what other links emerge. But immediately, I think it's. I don't see sort of a direct connection at the moment, but we'll have to see what emerges.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it was mentioning also secondary impact on radicalization trends, which, you know, obviously is a concern.
I mean that'd be closer to South Asia. In South Asia, we've had Afghanistan, which is, you know, is an Islamist.
Is that right?
And again, there have been changes. I mean, John's point. I mean, where again the Taliban is a very nationalist group. Yeah. It does not want to sort of export, or you know, ideologically it professes not to export the ideology and other things outside. So we'll have to see what impact that has. But Afghanistan has, in fact, oddly enough, over the last 3.5 years, from a time when other countries, except for Pakistan, were concerned over what was happening, there's now deeper engagement with Afghanistan from South and Central Asia and the Gulf region.
Very true, yeah. There was also a very general question, which I think is interesting, basically for all of us. So we touch upon some of the factors behind armed conflict. weaken UN, criminal gangs, and so on. So the person is asking, are there other broader factors that might frame what's changed and why? Demographics, state fiscal capacity, information tech, which I suppose means disinformation. Are there structural themes you see? I mean, I think definitely all those things have an importance, no demographics, the fact that also it's becoming, I mean, certainly for Latin America, it is a problem because obviously we have lots of young people with no jobs, which can get into gangs more easily. And state fiscal capacity, I think, is part of the fact that the state is actually weaker and those states are stronger.
I would totally agree. These structural factors, they affect one another. So taking them individually, they don't mean much, but when we have the overall picture, that's when you see the salience of the points. So to that, I will add, yes, these aspirations of young people and the lack or missing peace dividends. I think in extremely fragile countries, there is also a sense that statehood and conquering central power does no longer bring the dividends that it used to. And so we see more and more conflicts that have non-state armed groups that are just happy to linger and to control very local areas. And then I think another structural factor is the mentality, the mindset of a winner take all. And so we're in a context in sub-Saharan Africa where authoritarianism is rising. Then you see groups within the country that are more and more fighting because they know that a loss would bring them to the end of to their end politically. And so I think that a recipe there is like the inclusion of all groups as a key prevention measures structurally to address armed conflict.
Bad governance is just endemic and correlated very precisely to conflict. And second is the internationalization of conflicts. I thought your data on that was really interesting, Benjamin. But Syria is a very interesting case. It's enormously tempting for all sorts of foreign actors to intervene. 2 have already done so. The record in the Middle East is that doesn't actually help. But getting some sort of break on internationalization of conflicts, that's a challenge for the community.
Definitely. And another question, which I think we can answer, is are middle and smaller power increasingly likely to become involved in proxy conflict? I guess the answer is yes, based on what we have seen. So I think we are already past our hour and a half. I don't know, unless there is any other question from the audience. I think those we can maybe address separately. Thanks so much for your time, and we really appreciate your support on the report, and we hope it's going to be useful in your work, and you know, and we are here if you need anything. Thanks so much.
Thank you.